Yeah. Now, boys and girls, we are going to at least spend one day departing a little bit from the life of Christ. Now, why am I doing that? I love philosophy, and so we're going to get into philosophy a little bit. But B, the Sermon on the Mount is one of the most important things that we're going to be studying this semester. I've even anticipated that we were going to spend multiple lessons just on the content of Jesus' teaching there. And so we're kind of leaving what you might call metaphysics, who Jesus is, to ethics. What does Jesus say? How are we to live our lives? And ethics is really the heart of the Sermon on the Mount. So the most pragmatic and practical aspect of the life of Jesus, his ministry, and even this course, that's what we're entering into. And so I did ask the question to myself. I said, self, should I get into this, even though we're departing strictly from studying the life of Jesus? And so I asked Ricky advice. And so if this flops, it's all Ricky's fault. It's all his fault. I have nothing to do with this. No, but what I'm doing here is I'm presenting you with what we might call a prologue to studying the ethics of Jesus, because this is going to really hit culture. I mean, one of the pagans' favorite verses, and I'm going to repeat this more than once, comes right out of the Sermon on the Mount. What is the pagans' famous favorite verse? That's exactly right. You cited it perfectly. God says you're not supposed to judge. That's what Jesus said, so you can't judge me, And they say it with just that intonation, right? That's how they get out of a tight spot. So what I'd like us to do is go broad and talk about ethics in general, and then focus in on the specifics of what Jesus said. And so we'll set the Sermon on the Mount in the context of our chronology and the history of the time and so forth. We have time. We have time to breathe a little bit and think about this in some detail. But Christian ethics is nothing if it's not an appeal to objective moral values that we think are true, that we are to follow. And this is going to touch our culture in so many different ways that I just think this approach is going to be helpful to you. Because one of the questions that's going to have to be raised is, well, if Jesus said these things, does it matter to you? And why does it matter to you? For example, if Jesus tells you to do X, should you do whatever he says? And why? And there are people out there that want to massage Jesus' teachings into something else, to say something that he wasn't saying, so that they will not feel the responsibility that comes with actually having to follow the rule and or follow that moral value. They want them to be saying something else. So the God says or Jesus says you're not supposed to judge, they love that verse. Because now that gets them out of any obligations whatsoever to do what Jesus says. Jesus is nothing if he's not a moral teacher. In fact, that's what most people think Jesus is. He was just a great moral teacher of his time. Now, we are not denying the fact that he's a great moral teacher. We're just getting rid of the word just. He wasn't just a great moral teacher, but he was a great moral teacher. And one of the other things that I'd like to impress upon you is what made him a great moral teacher is not that he said anything new. In fact, I have a quotation of C.S. Lewis in the commentary. In Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis has this great line. He goes, he didn't come to bring a new ethic. Crackpots do that. If he was saying something totally new, then we should actually consign him to the loony bin. The very point of a good moral teacher is to teach objective moral truths that are eternal, but he said it in ways that had not been said before. He said it with an authority that had not been said before. And like any good moral teacher, as Lewis says, he keeps bringing us back to those basic moral truths that we are to follow. Okay, so that's all by way of preface. Now, the other thing that's going on in our culture is people will say, you can't know God. You can't know that God is real. And as some of you are probably aware, C.S. Lewis makes this point in Mere Christianity, but others have made this point, that you can actually know God just through the fact that there are these things called objective moral values. And so what we're going to talk about today is the moral argument for God's existence. And what I would like all of you to do is, this is really what we would call a piece of natural theology. Natural theology being our ability to know God through reason as it reflects on the world around us, nature. And this also intersects with natural law. Natural law and natural theology are not the same thing, but they are very tightly connected. If natural theology, as Christianity has traditionally understood it, is valid, then natural law comes along and becomes a perfect expression of how we are to live our lives. So the claim that I'm making just the claim that every major Christian theologian before 1800 made, and that is you can know God through reason. You can actually prove that God exists through reason without any appeal to the Bible. And even more so, in particular, you can actually know that God exists through natural or morally true principles that everybody has access to. One of the things that constitutes being a sane person is being a person of conscience who actually wants to be a moral person. And the Bible teaches, and most philosophers down through history have taught, there are rationally accessible moral truths that we all just know simply by being human. And the biblical explanation for that is that we're all made in God's image, and therefore there are certain truths that we just know. Okay, so let's get some definitions. God, I'm defining as the deity worshipped by Abrahamic theists. This being is conceived of as transcendent and personal, and he is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good. He is the creator and sustainer of the cosmos, and he is the locus of our moral values who created human beings in his image. That is, in a nutshell, the worldview called Abrahamic theism. Christianity is an expression of Abrahamic theism. Now, I'm leaving aside for today whether it is fully okay to call the God of Islam the same as the God of all Abrahamic theists. I'm going to leave that for another debate. We're just going to simply speak of Abrahamic theism as constituting all of this. Because here's what our Muslim friends will at least grant. They will grant that there are objective moral values. And there are Muslims who also offer a moral argument for God's existence. I personally think they're inconsistent in doing so, but we were going to, again, leave that all to the side. And so when you're talking to someone who is not a Christian, one of the things that you need to impress upon them is it is imperative that they first acknowledge that the God of Abraham exists before you even open up the New Testament to walk them through the evidence for Christianity. If there is no God, then there's no one to raise Jesus from the dead. Right? So they have to first be a theist before they can become a Christian theist. This is what we call classical apologetics. And I am classical through and through. Okay? I'm that guy. But enough of that. Ethics. Ethics is also known as axiology. Axiology is a fancy word that just means the study of values. And ethics is the branch of philosophy that studies values or standards of behavior or right and wrong, the good life, and right living. Yes?
I was under the impression axiology was the study of first principles.
Not to my knowledge, but I'll look that up. Axiology is almost always, if you want to say it's the study of first principles in morality, possibly. But an axiom, so moral axioms, I guess that could work. But traditionally, axiology is the study of value. Okay. So these are our definitions. So ethics is a branch of philosophy that studies the good life. How should we now live? And so the moral argument for God's existence, and I'm sorry, this bugs me whenever this happens. So let's Let's do this. And I apologize, but we're about to make all of our corrections here. I thought I got all this. Ricky, it's all your fault.
He's working on the Jews somehow, some way.
Yeah, it's a conspiracy. So here are definitions of two different approaches to ethical philosophy. And one is ethical relativism and one is moral objectivism. Now, when you study ethics, how many of you have actually taken a course in ethics? I just want to see hands raised. Okay. So this is, by the way, this is the weakest area in theology for evangelicals. Would you agree with that?
The moral argument for God's existence?
No, just ethics, just the study of ethics in general.
100%. Yeah.
I think evangelicals have been great at studying like metaphysics and the deity of Christ and all that stuff. But when it comes to actually studying ethical principles, evangelicals are the worst.
Why is that?
I think because in the liberal, this is a speculative answer, but in the liberal fundamentalist divide, the liberals took the moral high ground and they wanted to stress, let's live for Christ, let's spread his kingdom, let's feed the poor, etc. And evangelicals were very keen on trying to preserve the creeds, which stressed the metaphysics of everything. And so there was this divide. And so instead of actually taking the moral high ground, evangelicals kind of left the study of ethics by the wayside. My ethical training as I was kind of coming through the ranks was very poor. A lot of the stuff I had to get on my own. I don't know if I took some courses in ethics in college, and they all promoted relativism. Okay, but I don't think I took a single course in ethics in seminary. It was not required.
Did you have a hierarchy of Christian thought class that kind of try and brace all of that together? Because I know at Biola that's what they do for Oliver 101.
No, we did not. I did not have that in seminary.
Because they touched on the moral argument and some of the cosmological, and they got into breaking down they try to jam pack a lot.
Sure.
And they in the end they look at some of the creeds.
Sure. Now, I will say Biola and Talbot and some schools that are apologetically conscious, they are doing a good job kind of raising these issues to the fore. But historically, I just think the evangelicals have really dropped the ball on this.
Just in terms of personal experience talking to evangelicals on virtue ethics.
Sure. They have no idea what virtue ethics even refers to.
Ricky can attest to how many times I've given that speech.
Now, when you study ethics, there are, and I don't have this on any slide, but when you're studying ethics, there are really three branches of ethics that ethicists really look at. There's meta-ethics, and that's really what I'm addressing here. Meta-ethics. That is asking for the foundations of ethical discourse in the first place. How do you go about thinking about ethics? And one of the most important questions that you ask before you even get into the study of ethics is, are there objective moral values? That is a meta-ethical question. You're not answering the question, is this a moral value that's objective? You're just asking, are there such things as objective moral values? Then we move into what is called normative ethics. What is the grid or what is the standard by which we make ethical decisions? And that would be things like the debate between utilitarianism and deontological ethics and virtue ethics. So that's normative ethics. Okay? And then finally, we get into applied ethics, and that's where you get into the specific ethical issues like, is abortion morally justifiable? Now, where is the debate going on in our culture war? It's all applied ethics. So when people were yelling at each other on the street, we have the No Kings protest going on this weekend. We have debates on at abortion clinics going on. The clash is because there's no point of agreement on meta-ethics and normative ethics. They've already assumed, both parties are already assuming a meta-ethic and a normative ethic before they even have this conversation. And so that's why it's not a conversation, it's a yelling match. Okay? Now, please don't get me wrong. Please don't get me wrong. Knowing this, what I'm about to tell you, is not going to solve all these cultural problems, okay? And so even if you get to talk to someone about the meta-ethical issues, it's going to be really hard to get them to sign off on the idea that there are objective moral values. There's a vested interest that people have in promoting relativism, okay? And so, but when I talk to unbelievers, I don't talk about whether abortion is morally justifiable or not. I don't get into that conversation unless they themselves want to press the issue. I talk about this. Are there principles, moral values, that are objectively true? So what is a value? I will speak of a value as an ideal or a standard, something you find worth in or something that is worthy of your commitment. So all of you got a feel for what a value is. A moral value would be a standard of behavior. And an objective moral value is a standard of behavior that is true for all people at all times, regardless of their own thoughts or beliefs or feelings about it. Okay, so let's play this game. Let's play this heretical hypothetical. You ready? Let's imagine that the Nazis had won World War II. And let's imagine that the Nazis took over the entire world. And let's imagine that the Nazis killed every single Jew on planet Earth, wiping out their seed forever. And let's imagine that through their propaganda campaign, every single human being on planet Earth came to believe and accept the Nazi philosophy, that killing the Jews was a really, really, really good thing. Isn't it wonderful that those people were wiped out? Let's imagine that all of that happened. Here's the question. Would it still be wrong to kill Jews? Even if every single human being came to believe that it was right to do so?
Can't you still be wrong?
Well, if you say it would still be wrong, that makes you a moral objectivist. If you say, well, in that case, if no one believed it, then it would be right to kill Jews. The relativist says that moral values are dependent upon human belief, and that is what makes them relative. Some people have one set of values, some people have one set of values, other people have another set of values. And the truthfulness of the value is tied to your belief in whether it's true or false. How many of you know who Ron Jeremy is? Ron Jeremy was at one point one of the most popular pornographic actors around. In fact, he was on reality TV shows, he was in interviews, and a few years ago, there was a church dedicated to witnessing to porn actors. They would actually go to shows. Now, they wouldn't go inside, but they would be outside and they would be handing out tracts. And Ron Jeremy actually became a friend of one of these pastors. And so they had a debate at Harvard University. And when they debated on the sexual practices of various people, Ron Jeremy kept saying in the debate, "This is so easy." And he would say, "How many of you like to engage in this behavior, this behavior, this behavior?" And everybody was laughing in the audience. It was really funny to them. And they were like, "Yeah, we like to do that, like to do that." And he thought he was winning the debate by just getting all the people in the audience to agree that this is okay. What people do is what makes their behavior right or wrong. If you choose to engage in this behavior, it's right. If you choose not to, well, then that's just not right for you. That is quintessential relativism. Okay?
You can't build a society off of that, though.
And that wouldn't prove that morals are objective. That would just mean that if we just collectively, arbitrarily choose a set of values to believe in, then we can just choose them and impose them on others. But you do have a good point. I mean, is building a society a good thing? Okay.
Depends on what standard.
It depends on what standard, that's right. Okay, but do you all understand the point of this? So ethical relativism is the philosophical presupposition maintaining that there are no objective moral values. There are no objective moral values. And of course, moral objectivism is the philosophical presupposition maintaining that there is at least one objective moral value. If you believe in one, at least one, then you are by definition a moral objectivist. So notice there's no third option here. Because between one and none, there's no third option. So if you're a moral objectivist, then you believe that there's at least one objective moral value. Now, let me go ahead and just say, as a moral objectivist myself, I do believe that there's more than one. I believe that there are multiple. But all you have to do is prove that there's one in order to be a moral objectivist and a justifiable, hold to a justifiable form of moral objectivism. Yes?
I thought that relativism was more like saying that maybe there are objective morals, but we won't get them right. Like, so what would that be? Like, say there may be an objective, but we just don't know it, or we can't know it.
That would be
Or,
agnosticism.
okay.
That would be a what?
Agnosticism.
It would be a form of agnosticism, but it cashes out to the same thing. Because if your attitude is, well, there might be, but who knows, then on a pragmatic level, you're just a moral relativist.
Okay.
Okay.
I thought that's what, like, relativists.
It's the same thing as the person who says, well, there might be a God, but I don't believe that there is a God. And so who knows? Well, you're an agnostic atheist. I mean, you're just a person who thinks there is no God or doesn't believe there's a God. And you're also making the claim that no one can know.
Yeah.
Those are two separate claims. If you yourself do not believe that there are objective moral values, that just by definition makes you a relativist. If your justification for that is, well, we can't know, well, that just means that you have an epistemological stance on the issue, which is tied to it in one sense, but that's a different issue. Yeah, go
I
ahead.
actually have a T-shirt that has nihilism on it with a large cross through it, or a line crossing through it, just because nihilism shows how self-defeating.
Yes, it is. It is. Nihilism is self-defeating. I think we can all agree on that, at least here in this room.
We say that the majority of people in the West are ethical relativists.
I would say that the majority of lay people in the West are. The majority of philosophers are not. But if you were to go to your typical sophomore in college and talk to them, they try to come across as sounding intelligent, but they're not. These are very uninformed people who think they know what they're talking about, and they just don't. And one of the reasons they talk this way is because their professors don't have a real stance on these issues that at least they convey to the people. But if I were to go in a room or an office with a typical philosopher who specializes in ethics, I would say the majority of them would actually say, well, yeah, I do believe that there are some things that are right and some things that are wrong. Also, I believe in the democracy of the dead. And the vast majority of philosophers down through the ages, from Aristotle to Plato to Buddha to whoever, will say, yeah, there are some things that are right and wrong, objectively speaking. Now, this brings me to what I think is a great argument for God's existence. And one of the reasons why it's good to master this argument, if you are not familiar with the natural theology, one of the things that I would like to do is encourage you to master this argument first. For two reasons. One, it's extremely practical, and it really touches the hearts and minds of so many people you run into. This is very relevant. Get into the cosmological argument, I think that those arguments are actually better, but in terms of just they're proving God's existence, but this is very relevant to people's lives.
I read that in Dr. William Lane Craig's voice, by the way.
You read that in what?
I read that in Dr. William Lane Craig's voice, by the way. In my head
Okay.
as I was reading it. I just
Well, this is Craig's version of the argument. So the version I'm giving you right here is a version that's been defended by Dr. Craig multiple times on campuses. And it's the one that really hits home because his opponent almost inevitably is a relativist. So let's look at the argument. If God does not exist, and by God, again, I mean the Abrahamic deity. If God does not exist, then there are no objective moral values. But the second premise denies that the consequent. So this is the antecedent, and the then sentence, that's the consequent. And so this follows an objective or a rational line of reasoning called modus tollens, where you deny the consequent so that you can deny the antecedent. And so we're saying there are objective moral values. And if these two premises are true, then it follows automatically that God exists. So you can't knock the argument as being invalid. So the only question is whether the premises are true. And it's standard procedure to look at the premise that's most controversial. And believe it or not, this first premise, you're going to get pushback from sophisticated philosophers on this, I promise you. I'm going to tell you how you can answer them. But this premise is actually not that very controversial among lay people. This is the controversial premise. When you go to professional philosophers, it flips. This is the uncontroversial premise, and that's the controversial premise. So that's very interesting. Okay? So let's look at this premise first.
When you say invalid, you mean it's not a contradiction, it doesn't commit a fallacy.
I'm not committing any fallacy in reasoning here in terms of the argument is set up in a perfectly valid way. A valid argument is one that follows the correct form. And I'm following a law of inference called modus tollens. This is standard, if you take a course in logic, this is just standard procedure in any logical course. The only question is whether the premises are true.
You can have an invalid, or you can have a valid.
So you can have a valid argument. This is a syllogism. You can have a valid argument that is unsound. And it's unsound because one of the premises are true. Sorry. Thank you. Apologize. An unsound argument is one where one of the premises is false. So the argument, in order for it to be truly persuasive, has to be both valid and sound. And since I'm presenting the argument, I bear the burden of proof. I bear the burden of proof to demonstrate that the argument is true. Okay? If you go out there and you say, okay, here's an argument, and you give this argument, you have to be able to defend it. Now, you got to be careful with people, because people will keep running back and forth denying the premises. So you need to look at them and say, oh, okay, so you don't agree with premise 2, that there are objective moral values. So let's have that conversation. And then in the middle of that conversation, they'll say, well, what does God have to do with it? Well, we'll get there, but we need to first establish that there are objective moral values. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's look at the evidence for there being objective moral values. The first thing that I will say is that the arguments for relativism are unsound. Now, how many of you have looked at these kinds of arguments for relativism? I just want to see a show of hands. The diversity thesis, the dependency thesis, and then the queerness argument. I'll tell you what the queerness argument is in a minute. But the first two arguments, the diversity thesis and the dependency thesis, these are the standard arguments for relativism you'll get in any philosophy textbook. To my knowledge, I just can't find any others. I can't find any other arguments for relativism. So raise your hand if you know what the diversity thesis is. Yeah, so you want to explain what it is?
I think it's, there's just so many different variations of morality called religions and
Very good.
cultures.
Right.
Therefore, there are no objective moral values.
Yes, so what the relativists will do is they will look across the landscape of various cultures and they'll say it is just a fact that morals differ in time and clime. So if I go here, if I go to Asia, it's actually good manners to slurp your soup during dinner. And if I come into the West, it's bad manners to slurp your soup during dinner, right? That's a very easy difference, right? But you look across the board, and there's so much diversity in the way people see the world that there can't be a set of moral principles that are true for everybody. That's an impossibility. And so they will really ring the changes on this. Now, before I give an answer to that argument, in fact, I'm going to open it up for discussion, right? But before I give that, the dependency thesis is the opposite side of the coin. So the first side of the coin is diversity. Look at all of the moral principles we see out there. They differ in time and climate. Clearly, dependency, that's the other side of the coin, they are determined by upbringing. If you're raised in this kind of home, you're going to be raised with this kind of value. If you're raised in this culture, you're going to adhere to these values. And so the dependency thesis just is the idea that because moral values depend on where you are raised, and because they are so diverse, there can't be an objective set of them anywhere. First of all, before we take another step, does everybody understand these two arguments? Nod your head if you understand. Okay, let's open it for discussion. How would you answer the diversity thesis?
I would force them to own their position.
Please elaborate.
I would say, if you would come at me and say, hey, Bays, how would you justify circumcision is right or wrong, or how would you justify X? I would say, Dr. Campbell, don't go for these modern controversies. Go, if you want to say morality is relative, then go for the throat and just say, I believe, slavery isn't good or bad. It's just
It just is. Yeah.
And rape isn't good or bad. It's morally relative.
Okay, I agree with what you're saying. You're giving a critique of relativism, but let's first look at the argument. Is this a sound argument for relativism? Does the diversity of moral values prove that there are no objective ones? Yes, Caleb.
I think C.S. Lewis answers this pretty well, even though he's not necessarily an ethicist. He says it's true that different cultures will have different details about their values. They don't not have any values at all. And what we see is, with your example, there is a particular way that is polite and impolite at the table. And so it's not so much a matter of arguing over what that politeness is, but that there is a polite way to be at the table.
Very good.
And so that diversity is rather relevant.
I think C.S. Lewis used the example of marriage. He says,
Yes.
you can have many wives on one culture and one wife, but the commonality is you can't just have any wife you want or any woman you want.
All right.
And he's like, that's kind of...
You can't go out in the street and randomly go, she's my wife.
Or if she's married, I can take her too.
Right.
It's like, you just can't do that.
So what the diversity thesis is doing is it's exaggerating the diversity itself. Now I'm going to leave that point and let's back up a little bit. Let's just say, for argument's sake, that 100% of the human race, every single human being had a different set of values. I understand that practically that's impossible for no one to share the same values in any given context, but this is a hypothetical thought experiment. Let's just assume that every single human being had a different set of values than another set, so that the 8 billion people on this planet, no one has any values in common. Okay? That means that diversity is just run amok, right? Here's my question to you. Does that prove relativism? No. It would only prove either that only one person walking around has the right set of values. Is that logically impossible? No. Or it would prove that no one has the right set of values. that everybody is wrong. But how would that prove relativism? We're asking the question, do objective moral values exist? And we all recognize that people have different values. That's why there's a debate here. But that's the question we're asking. And showing that different people have different values doesn't prove anything. Diversity only proves diversity of belief. But it doesn't prove either diversity of truth, nor does it prove that not one person has the right set. Yes?
I was kind of talking out loud. So if it's true that God has written our moralities on our hearts, then shouldn't that's the basis for it, right? So
Well, let's make sure we understand what we're doing here. We're trying to prove God's existence. And so I'm not assuming that God exists in the outset. I'm proving first that there are these things called objective moral values. And I'm saying that this argument for relativism is unsound. I'm saying this doesn't work. I mean, just because everybody has a different set of values doesn't prove that there are no objective moral values. It just means that either no one has come across the right set or that only one person has. Okay? As unlikely as it sounds, they're offering a deductive argument to wit, the diversity of moral values proves that there are no objective ones. And I'm saying that doesn't follow at all. Diversity only proves diversity, nothing more. Now, what was said by Caleb and Ricky is that we can actually take the other step and say they fail to make a distinction between a principle and its exemplification. So what they're saying is that I'm sitting at the dinner table in the East, and I know that I'm supposed to respect the host and show my appreciation for what has been fixed for me. That is a shared value that we in the West share with those in the East. But what do I do in the East? I slurp that soup because I'm showing them how much I enjoy it. But what do I do in the West? I don't slurp it because I'm being courteous of other people around me and so forth. But in both cases, I'm trying to do the same thing. I'm trying to show respect. And so what they're saying is the diversity isn't as stark as you might first appear. We look around and there's a whole lot of shared values that people have. So there's a kind of unity of values even in the midst of all this diversity. Okay? Now, how about dependency? Does the fact that I learn my values from my culture prove that they are not objective? Does the fact that I learn my values from my culture, that I'm culturally dependent, socio-culturally dependent upon my culture for my values, does that prove that they are not objective? I would say no, not any more than the fact that I've learned science from my culture. Do I doubt the objectivity of the existence of England just because I've never been there and I learned it from my culture? Should I? Should I deny the roundness of the moon because I've been told by my culture that that thing in the sky is the moon? Flat earthers might. But the sphericity of the globe, almost everything I know about science, I learned in the English language from people in my culture. And I don't think that what I'm dealing with there is unobjective. So why is the fact that I learn my values from my culture make it any less objective? These are the two best arguments for relativism. And you'll notice that in just a few minutes we've refuted them. And when I teach ethics to high schoolers, I spend 2 weeks doing nothing but trying to prove relativism to them. I show them film, I do all of this, and when we finally get to it, I said, have I convinced all of you that relativism is true? And on most occasions, some of my students know that I like to pull fast ones on them, but on most occasions they all start nodding their heads. It's like, that's very interesting because I'm not a relativist, and then they freak. And in 5 minutes, I showed that relativism is impossible. But I've not shown that objectivism is true, but I have shown that these arguments for relativism are just bad arguments. They're not just bad arguments, they're really, really, really bad arguments. Now, what about this one? The queerness, yeah, go ahead.
way that you show that they're unsound is that you've attacked, like, you didn't lay it out in the syllogism, you didn't lay their diversity or dependency in the syllogism
Right.
on paper to show,
Yeah.
here's where this premise is actually
Yeah.
true, that therefore it makes it unsound.
Right. In fact, on most occasions, in fact, I don't know if I am aware of a relativist who has laid out in syllogistic fashion a case for relativism. They usually just say, look at all the diversity. There's no way there can be objective moral values.
I think the mere fact of it being relative makes it impossible, almost,
Sure.
just because it's just like if you want to hold the diversity thesis and the dependency thesis, I would love to just say, like, if our values are dependent on this, then why argue?
That's right. That's right.
It's like there's no point in arguing.
Would it be correct to say that most ethical relativists are also relativists when it comes to truth?
Most are. You know, again,
Kind of hard to make a logical argument.
That's right.
True relativism.
that's right. Well, I don't know if you've ever argued with like a college student who that are in this mindset. They just tend to think that these things are just a given. Duh. The attitude is duh. I mean, of course. So it does. They are as deep as a tablespoon when it comes to understanding these things. By the way, I'm not trying to insult them as people. I'm insulting the educational system in which they're raised, because this, as we're about to see, this is just impossible. But I've not shown that it's impossible yet. I've just shown that their arguments for it are not very good. Now, what is the queerness argument? I don't know of any other philosopher that has given this argument except for J.L. Mackie. J.L. Mackie is an atheist who died in, I believe it was 1982, and he wrote a book called Ethical Relativism, Inventing Right and Wrong. Okay? So what is he saying there? Moral values are the product of the human mind. That's where they come from. And the queerness argument, this is not meant to be a comment on the LGBTQ community or anything like that. This is the old use of the word queer, which meant strange, weird, odd, that sort of thing. Okay, so I know that the people in that community have adopted queer as a badge of honor, you know. But that's the original word for queer. So in the 1950s, they would sometimes look at a homosexual and say, well, he's queer. That means he's odd, he's strange, okay? So that's where that comes from. So when J.L. Mackie mentions the queerness argument, what he's saying is, what are the consequences of saying that there are objective moral values? That would mean that, say the value, don't slurp your soup at dinner, or be polite to your neighbor, is this idea that's just floating around out there. It's an immaterial kind of thing, like a Platonic form that's just sort of floating around out there, and we're just sort of catching it. And that's just odd. That's just weird to think about. Clearly, the only things that exist in our world are material objects. Now, as all of you can see, J.L. Mackie is not really giving you an argument here, but he's giving you a prejudice. He doesn't think an immaterial realm exists, and therefore, for him, it's really odd. But he still has to demonstrate that there are no immaterial entities whatsoever. And there's other things we can do in natural theology. For example, we can show that we have a soul, for example. Well, that would be immaterial. Right?
Laws of logic.
The laws of logic could be considered immaterial. So they're all mathematical truths are immaterial. And if numbers really do exist, I know that's debated, we could argue for that. So the point I'm making is there are lots of really intelligent people out here that are not going to really just be so blasé about this. They're going to say, wait a minute, why think that there are no immaterial kinds of things? And if there at least could be, maybe there are these immaterial things called laws of morality. Okay. All of you understand this back and forth? Okay. So let's look at my case. Now I'm going to flip it. I'm going to say the case for relativism is really bad, but can the moral objectivists do better? And I want I want to give 3 arguments for moral objectivism, and I've found these to be very effective as a person who's a teacher and who presents this material to his students. First, relativism is self-defeating. I can give a million anecdotes on this. This is a common one that's given. I don't even know if it's true, but there's a story of the professor who gave a writing assignment to his philosophy students, and a philosophy student wrote his paper defending relativism. And the professor graded the paper, handed it back, and the student had an F. The student goes to the professor and says, "Why did you give me an F?" And the professor says, "Because you handed it in a blue folder." Well, I don't like blue folders. You can't do that. That's unfair. But in a world where there are no objective moral values, there's no such thing as fairness. Now, that puts the student on the horns of a dilemma. He could argue that the professor was acting unfairly, objectively speaking, but that would mean that his thesis is disproven and he deserves an F on his paper. Or he could argue that morals are relative anyway. That would mean that the F on the paper is totally justified on relativism. Yes.
I was going to say that I think the best way to refute it is that they can't even engage in a debate at all to
That's
even
right.
argue it, because like you have to be assuming that there's an answer if you're even going to have the conversation.
That's a point that Lewis makes as well, and I think the way he raises it is it goes something like this. People think that the fact that people debate ethics makes it relative, but the very fact that they're engaging in this debate is itself a testimony to the fact that deep down they know that there's something objective they're talking about. Other than a couple of geeks in their mom's basement, there are not a whole lot of people just strenuously debating the merits of Star Wars vis-a-vis Star Trek, as if to say that, there's a whole lot riding on this.
I think you're a little out of touch, Dr. Gephardt.
Well, like I said, there are a handful of geeks sitting in their mom's basement debating this, and they're losing sleep over it. But most normal people don't.
Class.
I'm sorry? Or in this class. That's right, in this class.
It's a little more than a handful.
But nobody is going to look at that debate and go, there's just so much riding on this. But whether abortion is true or valid or not, or the death penalty, or take any other ethical issue that's in our culture, people are fighting tooth and nail over this because deep down they know that there's something that really matters here. Okay. But having said that, relativism is self-defeating because you can almost pick any relativist out there and prove that he's not really a relativist. I have a dear friend. He married a lady who was a self-proclaimed relativist. And a few weeks after I met her, they were heading off to Washington. This is in the early 2000s. They were heading off to Washington to protest the Iraq invasion because it was an unjust invasion. Well, there's nothing wrong with the invasion of Iraq if relativism is true. I mean, so what if there were weapons of mass destruction? If we just feel like invading a country and killing some people, so what? So relativism is self-defeating in the sense that you can't really run into relativists. There are people out there that have the theory of relativism, but they aren't actually relativist. They actually do think that there are some things out there that are right and some things that are wrong. Now, let me give you 2 responses to this argument. One is really, really bad, and one is really, really interesting. The first response that you're going to get from some people is they'll say, well, wait a minute, all you're really saying is that no one can actually be a relativist, that it's not of much use in your day-to-day living. But that doesn't refute relativism. The fact that relativism is not very practical doesn't mean that it's not true. After all, many of you may not know anything about Einstein's theory of relativity. Meaning that what Einstein said is not that practical in your day-to-day life, but does that mean that relativity is not true? Of course not. So the fact that you might have a theory called relativism doesn't mean that it's false just because you can't apply it in your life. Here's why that's a very, very bad response. Ethics just is the philosophy of action. Ethics just is a practical philosophy. So the very fact that you can't apply this ethic just is a reason to reject it. You can't say, well, just because this ethical theory is not practical doesn't mean it's false. Actually, it does mean it's false because you can't live it.
Yep. I get that every single time I wear my analyst t-shirt, somebody wants to argue with me about it.
Yeah.
Every single time they say, just because I can't live it doesn't mean it's not true. I was like, yes, it does.
Yes. If we were talking about something like the theory of relativity, that would be a good point. That would be a metaphysical point. Just because your metaphysics isn't all that practical doesn't mean it's false. But if your ethic is impractical, that by definition means your ethic is false. Okay? All of you get that? Is that fair? Okay. There's another response that people will give to this argument that I think is intriguing and we need to chew on. And often when I talk about relativism, I do point out the fact that if relativism is true, there literally is nothing anybody can do that you can condemn. And I love to give the quotation of Ted Bundy, where we actually have a recording of Ted Bundy talking to his victim. He recorded a sort of a monologue he gave against one of his victims, and he said, look, who are these others that I have to respect? And he said to his victim, look, whatever joy I might get in preserving your right to live doesn't come close to the joy and happiness I'm going to get from raping and killing you. Okay? Now, if relativism is true, there's nothing wrong with what Ted Bundy did. Now, most people can't bear that. In fact, most relativists can't bear that. And so their counter response to this argument is that this argument only refutes subjectivism. It doesn't refute relativism. So, what's the difference? A subjectivist believes that morals are relative between person and person. So if I live in your neighborhood, I can expect that my values are not going to be the same as yours and yours and yours and yours and yours. And therefore, anything goes in a society. And so a subjectivist has to admit that what Ted Bundy said to that woman and what he eventually did to her was totally okay. Or at least there's nothing wrong with it. And all of us realize that is just unconscionable. And now you can just lay on layer after layer of anecdotes of what you have to sign off on if you're a subjectivist. There's nothing wrong with the Holocaust. There's nothing wrong with the cleansings in the Soviet Union by Stalin. And on and on and on it goes. And so what most relativists today will say is, we're not subjectivists. We're socio-cultural relativists. Meaning that morals don't differ, or they are not relative person to person, but they are relative culture to culture. I do remember Hillary Clinton, when she was running for president in 2016, she kept saying, Donald Trump does not reflect our values. Okay, he may reflect the values of somebody else, and that's fine over there, but why should you vote for me? Because I reflect the values of America. Now, if I were to sit down with Ms. Clinton and ask her about meta-ethics, I have a feeling that she would say, I'm a socio-cultural relativist. At least that's how she comes across. Do you all understand the difference between a subjectivist and a socio-cultural relativist? So this argument only refutes subjectivism. It doesn't refute socio-cultural relativism. Now, I understand that there's a counter-response to give, but hopefully all of you understand the difference. Nod your head if you understand, or shake your head. Okay. You have an insight, Ricky?
Well, I mean, but doesn't it still
And all the subjects thing? Wait,
relativism
Yeah.
still has to, in order for relativism to be relativism, you still have to have subjects that make it up, even if it is sociocultural. Like you just get all these other subjects to agree with you.
Yeah, your response is third verse, same as the first, a little bit longer, a little bit worse, right?
I was going to ask if sociocultural relativists would just be a relativist that is kicking the can down the road.
Yeah, he's a relativist that kicks the can down the road. The sociocultural relativist has the following problem. First, a collection of subjects, each of whom has a set of beliefs that are not objectively true when we're talking about morals. If you collect them together, that doesn't make them any more objective. And therefore, we're not really helping ourselves out with this. This is not getting us anywhere. The other problem with it is that what about the person who has the daring to escape the herd morality of the culture? In fact, some people think that that's actually the sign of bravery. I'm going to go against the herd and say X is okay. And then finally, that's where this argument comes in. The moral reformer's dilemma is a really great response to sociocultural relativism. Because what makes a value good in a relativist culture? Well, whether the culture itself upholds it or not. But if sociocultural relativism is true and valid, then there are no such things as moral reformers in that culture. Now, I would suspect that most of you want to say that there are moral reformers in various cultures. You see, if sociocultural relativism is true, then what makes slavery okay in the antebellum South? The fact that this culture upheld it as right. And therefore, someone like a Frederick Douglass, who fought against slavery at that time, what is he in that culture? He is by definition immoral. Take anybody that came along and said that the morals taught in our culture are wrong. Anybody who does that is by definition immoral. So Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Confucius, Buddha, Jesus, Martin Luther King Jr., all of those people are by definition immoral because they went against the societal norms of their day. The other problem is, how do you know that you've made a moral improvement? Okay, did we make a moral improvement by getting rid of slavery, or did we not make a moral improvement by getting rid of slavery? The relativists can't answer that question. They don't have an answer. Because by definition, there's no objective standard by which you judge the changes in society. Okay? So do y'all understand these first two arguments for moral objectivism? One more. There is at least one self-evidently true objective moral value. There's one, and I would say it's self-evident. Now, I'm going to go ahead and cut off at the pass any potential objection that comes to this, because I will often offer this and people say, prove it. I'm like, it's self-evident. Self-evident truths don't need proof. 2 + 2 = 4 is self-evident. So I'm going to say to you that if you don't know this, that says something about you, not the principle that I'm about to state. And here it is. Don't torture babies for the fun of it. Raise your hand if you don't agree with that principle. Here's a bad argument for the principle. We can't find any culture anywhere that does such a thing. That's a bad argument for the principle. I'm telling you it's self-evident. That's what it means. What if I said 2 + 2 = 4 and you said, prove it? Well, if you know what the symbol 2 and the plus sign and the other 2 and the equal sign and the number 4, if you know what those symbols mean, it's self-evident. If you know what a baby is, and you know what torture is, And you know what the terms "for the fun of it" is. You know that it's right and good to refrain from torturing babies for the fun of it. What if I were to go into a culture and it was a culture of baby torturers? Babies were born in that culture for the purpose of torturing, just for the fun of it. I get my jollies out of torturing babies. Would you? No, they've so crafted the reproductive system that that culture can survive and still torture babies for the fun of it. You can imagine such a thing. Now,
The babies can't feel any pain though. They don't have enough moral.
I walk into that culture, I take my ethics class into that culture, and I find that that culture is doing it. Do I look at all them and go, back to the drawing board? I got to go back and come up with another self-evidently true moral principle. Woe is me. We found an example of baby tortures. Is that the right response to such a situation? I would like to think that all of you would join me in fighting the baby torturers and saving those babies from torture. In fact, that's a hill that I think we should all die on. To give our lives for those who are suffering in that way. So I would like to suggest to all of you that there's an easily accessible, self-evidently true, objective moral principle that all of you know, and if you don't know it, at least after I've said it, there's something wrong with you. You're as morally handicapped as someone who says that 2 + 2 = 5. You're like a blind man who says there's no sun because I can't see it. That's something wrong with you. There's something wrong with your eyes. And I would say there's something wrong with you as a person, your character. I taught a course years ago at Darton, and in the middle of the course, we got into an argument back and forth, and one student says, well, I just can't see that that's objectively true. And we went back and forth, and I've usually been able to convince students that this is an objectively true moral principle, and at the end of the 30-minute back and forth, I finally looked at him and said, I have to come to the very disturbing conclusion that I'm looking at a fundamentally immoral person.
And you were arguing that torturing babies is wrong.
He goes, I would never do it, but I just can't see that it's objectively false. And again, I just repeat myself, you, by definition, are an immoral person. And I don't regret saying that at all, because if you can't see the truth in that, there's something wrong with you.
So why wouldn't you do it if you can't see it?
What's always bad?
Well, that's a really good question. I think that by definition means that deep down he did see it. But it didn't jive with his own atheism.
And well, I would be cautious about pointing that out if you were alone with the guy.
Yeah.
But he was packing stuff, he had it covered.
We are going to pick up the argument. We're going to pick up the argument Saturday, and then we're going to get into the Sermon on the Mount.